So starting in verse 38 of John 18. So Jesus had been to Herod. He's been returned to Pilate. Verse 38 says that Pilate went out again to the Jews, starting about midway in the verse. Pilate went out again to the Jews, and he said to them, I find no fault in him at all. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews? And they all cried out, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. I'm going to stop right there for a second because that comment of Barabbas being a robber, it's just a generic term for criminal. And that brings up an interesting point that I want to take the opportunity to explain how this passage, if you look at it over all four Gospels, actually defeats a common criticism about the Gospels and the Bible in general. There are critics who will say that the idea that Jesus was God incarnate, the idea of Jesus as the Savior, that this is all things that developed over time. It was later legend that was added on to the maybe historical person. Maybe there really was a carpenter and he really was a traveling preacher. But they say it evolved over time. And one of the things they'll point at to say it evolved over time is the differences in the Gospels. One common thing they'll point at is in the kind of burial resurrection narratives. They'll say Mark is the first gospel that was written. I personally think it was Matthew, but that's neither here nor there. But they'll say Mark was the first gospel written. It's the simplest, it's the basic, it gets straight to the point, not a lot of frills. And then Matthew wrote, and he used some of Mark, and then Luke wrote, and he relied on them but added more, and then John wrote, and John writing the latest is where you get all the fantastical, miraculous things, and they say that was the order that they're building on, it's evolving, it's developing, and so this legend grew out. The problem is that here in the story of Barabbas, it works in the exact opposite order. If you take a view of the Bible evolving the story through the Gospels, then you look at the story of Barabbas being released, and we're all familiar with the story. But the story of Barabbas is simple. John actually presents the most basic, most straightforward, no frills story of Barabbas. Right, that there is this custom at Passover, that Pilate is finding no fault in Jesus, that Jesus is referred to as King of the Jews. Crowds are demanding Barabbas be released instead of Jesus. Right, you have Pilate appealing to the crowd. You have that he releases Barabbas and calls for Jesus' crucifixion, and it describes Barabbas as a robber, as a criminal. But that's the basic story we all know. But if you dig into the details, it actually, and if you use this kind of evolution of the story view, then you would have to say, well, the next one would be Luke, because Luke has all of that, but he adds in that Barabbas isn't just a criminal, he's a rebel and a murderer. But then in Mark, you have not only all of that and him as a rebel and a murderer, Mark mentions that it's the chief priests. The whole reason of this, it says Pilate knows that they're just envious of Jesus and that it's the chief priests stirring up the crowds. And Matthew includes all of that, but then Matthew adds in that Pilate, right where he washes his hands, that's in Matthew. Right? He says, this isn't on me. That he washes his hands of it, and it has the part where Pilate's wife will actually come to Pilate and say, hey, I had a vision, have nothing to do with this man. So if you take this idea that the story is evolving over time, here you have the order that would be John, Luke, Mark, and Matthew. But that goes completely against what scholars want to say from other things, that it's Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. So you can actually pick out different stories from the Gospels, and depending on the amount of details each one includes, you could come up with a different order of the Gospels just depending on which story you're claiming evolved. And if you can pick any story and have any different kind of order, depending on the passage you're looking at, then this idea that the Gospels are an evolution of legend over time just falls flat, dead in the water. It has no standing. And so this issue over Barabbas actually shows us that this mindset that a lot of critics have as they approach the Gospels doesn't actually hold up.